Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you to your institution, the GSA, for inviting me and to your students. I hope what I will present has some relevance or resonates to some degree with your students and to everyone else who's participating. I do have to say that what I will be presenting on is also for me a bit unresolved because one is working with a very interesting topic, which is space. There are so many dimensions, and I'm sure you guys as architects know all of those many dimensions around space. But should at any point you need clarification, please feel free to just ask questions and to stop me on anything. But what I will do is sort of go through a few slides just to give some sort of context and to put forth a few propositions. And then I will open the presentation up for a few questions based on what I would have presented. If that's fine, I'll just start. Cool, thank you so much. So as Huda, you've explained in my short bio, my interests are mainly in visual culture and curatorship. However, I am pursuing my doctoral studies in Afrofuturist aesthetics. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the term Afrofuturism. I myself am trying to grapple with this term, even though I'm 5 years now into my PhD, and I'm no closer to finding what it means, what it could mean, and so on. It's just a very interesting term. So the title of my PhD study is termed The Exploration of Blackness in Afrofuturist Aesthetics, Foregrounding a Dialectic. And the whole idea behind the study is to sort of present diverging viewpoints on what Afrofuturism may be. Sorry. So let me just get into the title of this particular presentation. It is quite intentional that I titled it, What Do We Demand from Spaces? Because as I've said, the idea of spaces is quite convoluted. I think on a very basic level, we can all understand that we're not just talking about boundlessness or some form of expanse. But within this title, there is an insinuation that space is indeed abstract, that there's something that can be derived from space or ascribed to it. Or put differently, there's a suggestion that space can be politicized. And this is the proposition that I would like us to engage with in this presentation. So one of the things that I'm thinking about in my study broadly is, why is there a need to create spaces or a space that is ideologically wired in a certain manner? I'm going to repeat that. Why is there a need to create a certain space that is ideologically wired in a certain manner? And within the realm of Afrofuturism, I think the person who gives much consideration to this is the jazz musician and philosopher, someone widely known as the Afrofuturist progenitor, Sun Ra. In his film Space is the Place, and I quote him from the film, he says, "The music is different here. The vibrations are different. Not like planet Earth. Planet Earth's sounds of guns, anger, and frustration. We'll set up a colony for Black people here. We'll see what they can do on a planet all on their own, without any white people there. We'll bring them here either through isotope teleportation, or better still, teleport the whole planet here through music." End quote. I am going to come back to this quote a bit later on, but I think from just stating it, one sort of gets a sense that Sun Ra is expressing deep sentiments about the nature of planet Earth and why it is unhospitable for a particular type of people, being Black people. And therefore, he imagines an alternative reality, an alternative dispensation in which Black people can exist in. And I think this is very crucial in answering the question, why is there a need to create spaces that are ideologically wired in certain ways? So to sort of bring it more into better focus, I am concerned in my study and indeed in this presentation with this idea of the Afrofuture. It's a very big idea, it's a very big term, and I think that in recent contemporary history, it's been given a lot of attention, especially within our visual cultures and our sonic cultures and so on. But I think one thing I certainly find is that in Afrofuturism, one of the things it does very well is engage with colonial representations of Africa, of African people, of Black people. I find that one thing Afrofuturism does and does quite well is respond to and critique classical colonial representations of Africa and in a wide sense of Black people. And so we see this happening throughout Western history, most notably within the Enlightenment project. And there are a few notable philosophers who are sort of implicated in this. And one of them is George Hegel, who in his philosophy of world history presented a very contentious interpretation of what he termed world history. And in essence, he presented a very denigrating image of Africa. He argued that, and I quote him on this, he says, "At this point we leave Africa, not to mention it again, for it is not historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit. Historical movements in it, that is, in its northern part, belong to the Asiatic or European worlds. Egypt will be considered in reference to the passage of the human mind from its eastern to its western phase. But it does not belong to Africa nor to the African spirit. What we properly understand by Africa is the unhistorical, undeveloped spirit still involved in the mere conditions of nature and which had to be presented here as only on the threshold of world history." End quote. So you have a very colonial construction of what Africa is. It is unhistorical, it is undeveloped. But Hegel does something more with this construction. It's almost like he fixes Africa in time and space. He renders it as incapable of moving, as incapable of adapting, of mutating, and being, a continent that is sufficiently capable of existing throughout history. So there's this idea of fixity, fixing Africa to a particular temporal moment. And such iterations, of course, have sort of found iteration throughout history. I mean, a year or two ago, we had Donald Trump calling Africa a shithole country. And we sort of go back to these colonial essentialisms of Africa and so on. So I'm sort of postulating towards this idea of thinking of the Afrofuture as a space where one can contest some of these colonial constructions. So we can think of the Afrofuture as a space of self-conception where where African identities or the identities of those who are marginalized and assigned in particular ways can re-articulate themselves anew. So it can be a space of subversion. One can think of it as a space of subversion. One can also think perhaps of the Afrofuture as a space that can enable healing. Because when one thinks of colonial trauma and everything that has happened on the continent, one can inscribe healing as a necessity. So something that I'm also thinking about in relation to the Afrofuture is a space that can help facilitate some sort of self-understanding, a self-understanding that rejects the constant construction of Africans as anti-human, if you will. right? Um, so in just thinking about just the orientation of the space that is the Afrofuture, I think, within discourse, within philosophy, there are a few precedents that almost have similar intentions. One can think of here David Harvey's work where he theorizes the notion of spaces of hope. And this is in response to, in particular, thinking of alternative spaces outside of capitalism. And Harvey was in conversation with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in their seminal text, the Communist Manifesto. So the idea behind the spaces of hope is to sort of think around alternative dispensations. What world order in the era of globalization can one dwell in or exist in? Equally so, one can also think about Michel de Certeau in his seminal text, The Practice of Everyday Life, where he foregrounds the idea of tactical space. And again, he's sort of imagining or posturing, at least in my interpretation, towards an alternative ways of existing and assuming power. But within my studies, two seminal figures whom I've certainly used and I try to incorporate the work is Michel Foucault, who theorizes around the idea of a heterotopia, which has an interesting relation to the idea of a utopia. So I'm finding that Foucault presents the heterotopia as a sort of counter site, right? An alternative space that one can perhaps sort of escape into, an ideal or fictive or even mythic place where one might live out an alternative reality. So, and there have been subsequent interpretations of this idea of heterotopias. For instance, Robert Tobinka helps us understand that heterotopias clash with dominant orders. They simultaneously produce new ways of knowing. Kevin Harrington has also given nuance to this idea by explaining that due to their innate capacity to destabilize dominant orders, heterotopic sites enable acts of resistance and subversion, thus enabling alternative ways of reordering. So similarly, Homi Bhabha, in his text, The Location of Culture, puts forth the idea of the third space of enunciation. And I'm quite interested in this idea and what it means and how one can apply it, because Bhabha sort of positions the third space as a sort of marginal space, an in-between space, a non-resolute space. And he says of the third space that it is a space of difference that can allow some form of cultural pluralism. And I think that is quite important towards contesting this idea of fixity, of constantly fixing Africa in a particular spatial temporal location, if one can call it that. But more importantly, Barbara says of the third space that it can allow for new positions to emerge. And I find this also very pertinent to this idea of contesting colonial representation of Africa as this undeveloped, this fixed space and people that is incapable of movement by all costs. So, that's the main proposition that I wanted to put forth that I think we can really engage in, and we can possibly engage in a question and answer sort of thing. But this is what I'm thinking about with regards to what do we demand from space. So in thinking about space, how can we, at least on an ideological level, articulate spaces that are able to appeal to our conditions, to our histories, to our desires, and to our ambitions, and spaces that are inherently politicized, spaces that can enable us to constitute our identities in very meaningful ways. So I'm going to stop there and invite everyone for questions or just feedback or comments or commentary, anything.
Thank you, Thabang. I wonder if before we, so while everyone is thinking about questions or comments, if maybe you could say a bit more about your own practice as a curator and how you, and through some, maybe give us some examples of how you think through some of these ideas in your practice or in your work.
So, I mean, in my curatorial work, my master's project was specifically had a certain component that was invested in curatorship, and it was essentially concerned with glass aesthetics in South Africa, and I was concerned with these ideas of hierarchies within glass practice and how to sort of unsettle or destabilize these hierarchies. So you have very conventional and authoritative terms like a master glass artist and an apprenticeship and so on. And I wanted to sort of open up the language, or at least how we can think about glass practice in South Africa, by rupturing those binaries, if you will, and to think about glass as not only isolated within the confines of art and craft, but to think along glass as something that can permeate in different spaces. Glass can be located within interior design spaces, fine art spaces, architecture, and so on. So my process of curation for that exhibition was I had my exhibition in what I thought was a hybrid space. It was a house, it was an architectural firm, and it was an art gallery as well. So it sort of shifted away from the conventional white cube, and I was very intentional about the decision to have my exhibition in a space that can help me consider the different languages that glass practice can be located in, the different areas that glass practice can be located in. So in a way, I was sort of looking for an ideological translation into how this idea of glass as, or the multi-dimensions of glass could be explored in a very material way. And so that was the whole crux of it, to sort of rupture those binaries that exist within the glass practice itself.
And is your PhD focused on, does your PhD have an element of practice in it?
No. This is just a written theory document.
Okay, any questions or thoughts? Thank you for expanding on that.
Pleasure.
Hey, Thabang.
Hi, Tuli.
Thanks for your thing. I wanted to ask maybe, I wrote about Afrofuturism a little bit in my master's, and I also found it confusing to work out a workable definition that stayed Afrofuturism. But I wonder if you can talk about whether you see parallels between like South African Black consciousness and Afrofuturism, in the sense of, like, I guess some sort of speculative belief about Blackness, in the case of Black consciousness, that Black people can be included in the category of human, which this was a speculation in many ways. But yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've been grappling with this a lot, and thank you for this very cumbersome question. One of the things that I'm trying to do in my study is actually incorporate Black consciousness into reading Afrofuturism, and I'm not sure how successful I have been yet. But one of the things I find in reading a lot of the scholarship on Black consciousness is that it does try to recuperate, and perhaps not bombastically aestheticize the idea of the human, but it does try to re-dignify, for lack of a better word, the human subject. Right? And I think this is a very intentional ideological project from people such as Biko, who are very intentional about explaining that Black people should galvanize around their very skin. And this is one of his propositions, is that should galvanize around the Black skin, but to also reimagine the Black South as being worthy of a humanity. And so I don't think he's right, I don't think he's wrong, but I think it's a very valid proposition. And I do think that Black consciousness does have a lot to offer Afrofuturist discourse in helping us understand and complicate the very idea of the human, is who's considered human and by whom. So I think it goes back to the colonial construction, because Biko is very intentional about speaking back to that source of power and to say, well, within your Blackness, there's so much humanity to behold. So I think, I'm hoping that this is one of the things my study can address, that Black consciousness is a very valid discourse that can help us complicate in better ways how we can understand the category of the human. So I'm not sure whether that answers you, but I think it's certainly a valid claim. It's certainly a valid claim.
Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. We'll have to talk more about it.
Yes, definitely.
I mean, maybe I could also ask you to speak a bit more about this. You talked a bit about heterotopias as a kind of space of hope, as possibility for something alternative. And similar, you related to that to Sanraz, the kind of these different vibrations. And I wonder if you could maybe talk us through how you see that, or where you see that in artwork or in discourse, maybe.
Well, I think a very important text within Afrofuturism is Sun Ra's Space is the Place. It's a film that was made in 1974. And in that film, he puts forth a lot of propositions that circulate around the atrocities that Black people face on planet Earth. So in typical Afrofuturist fashion, Sun Ra does an interesting engagement with Black history. So he goes back in time to extrapolate things from Egyptian mythology and Egyptian history, and he uses those to articulate his present condition and propels himself into an alternative reality and a future and so on. So in terms of the idea of spaces of hope, that's specifically David Harvey's formulation, but I think it's got some applicability in thinking about the Afrofuture. And this is something certainly I'm trying to apply to it, in the sense that, when it comes to discourse within Afrofuturism, it engages a lot with trauma, the slave Atlantic, the issues of slavery, issues of indenture, issues of colonialism, issues of apartheid. And within trauma, there is always an engagement with healing. And I think if we can think about articulating spaces that can allow for conversations around healing, then we are engaging with an Afrofuture. If we can articulate conversations that are sensitive to forms of trauma that are persistent, that have never stopped at a particular time. For instance, in South Africa, one can almost say that 1994 was the end of all atrocities that are inflicted on the so-called marginalized. But, you know, one could also present a counter argument that some of those atrocities from the past still inform the present, and they are still coming into the present, and they will continue to present themselves in the future. And I think with the recent pandemic around COVID-19, we are seeing, for instance, with the military, how the military is deployed in the townships, how they are almost nostalgic sentiments of the past that are presencing themselves in the present. And I think if one were to articulate an Afrofuture, you are pursuing a very generative way of imagining what traumatized people can do in order to heal, or how they can engage with the wounds that have not healed. So I think spaces of hope becomes a very useful way of, even if that hope is never attained, but at least the idea of gesturing towards it becomes, I think, a very generative way of engaging with a space that is inscribed with agency, that is inscribed with self-constitution.